I'm Tucker, and today we look at the horror of deaths that are broadcasted on television. From a stagehand rushing through compressed safety checks beneath live pyrotechnics, to a TV host attempting to calm an overcrowded pavilion as a wave of panic sends hundreds surging toward him. It was June 18, 2016 in Austin, Texas. The Midsummer Festival was packed with families crowding the streets and local television crews moving between camera points to prepare for the evening broadcast. The night was clear after earlier storms had delayed events, and while the festival looked lively and controlled on screen, behind the stage, rushed work and overlooked safety margins set the conditions for a fatal mistake. Thomas Reed, 28, was a freelance stage rigger hired through a small production company contracted for the broadcast. He had years of experience setting up truss systems, lights, and support lines, but had a reputation for saying yes to last-minute calls, even when conditions weren't ideal. Colleagues knew him as precise, though his willingness to bend to production pressures often left him working without full preparation. Freelancers like him rarely had the luxury of refusing work, especially when tied to high-visibility broadcasts, where networks and sponsors demanded speed over caution. Stage rigging is inherently dangerous. Heavy lighting units suspended overhead, fire cues positioned around tightly packed equipment, and live performers moving close to unsecured hazards. It relies on exact placement and spacing, especially when pyrotechnics are added. Even small errors in distance between mortars and flammable rigging increase the risk of catastrophic failure. That night, Reed had been called in to reposition lines after weather delays compressed the setup schedule. Checks that should have taken an hour were condensed into minutes, leaving little margin for oversight. The segment he worked on was particularly hazardous. A local TV affiliate had scheduled a live fireworks cue as part of the show finale, a risky choice given the proximity to stage equipment. Crew members later admitted the pyrotechnic checks were cut short, with a mortar placed only a few feet from overhead rigging to accommodate the camera's street angle. Festival organizers had already pushed the timing back, and the decision was made to move ahead despite warnings from two technicians that spacing was tight. With the crowd already in place and live airtime approaching, the call to proceed was locked in. Eyewitnesses recalled Reed pacing near the edge of the stage, adjusting a line that ran across the truss frame above the fireworks setup. A technician off-frame called ready, and the first shells launched successfully, rising clean into the night. As the second was triggered, it misfired, igniting partially inside the launch tube. Cameras caught the resulting flare and shower of sparks that spread across the lower stage area, where Reed was working just feet from the ignition point. The misfire sent sparks and burning fragments across the platform, scorching nearby rigging and striking equipment. A sound technician later described fragments of casing and burning debris, some large enough to fill a hand, raining down as the truss ignited. Reed was struck by shrapnel in the chest and face and caught in the shower of sparks. His figure was visibly collapsing as others rushed forward. Crew members scrambled through sparks and heat, some calling for emergency, while two men pulled Reed's limp body from the hazard zone. His clothing and harness smoked heavily, and his exposed skin was blackened and blistering. He was still breathing when medics arrived, though barely responsive. They secured his airway with intubation and began aggressive fluid resuscitation before transport. Emergency responders administered immediate care before transporting him to a regional hospital. By then, Reed had sustained third-degree burns over much of his torso, blunt trauma from the impact of the fragments, and inhalation injuries. He was pronounced dead the following day after repeated efforts to stabilize him failed. The aftermath played out unevenly. The pyrotechnics vendor was cited and fined, but no charges stuck. The affiliate quietly ended live fireworks segments, though without a public announcement, and city officials pushed new permitting requirements that most festival organizers only reluctantly adopted. For Reed's parents, the investigation meant little. The final report reduced their son to crew member fatally injured, a line item in a binder that marked how the show had gone wrong. It was September 8, 2015, above Interstate 405 in Los Angeles, California. Evening conditions showed clear skies with unlimited visibility, but increasing winds from an approaching weather system, with gusts reaching 25 miles per hour and turbulence reported by other aircraft. Robert Hayes, 33, was a traffic reporter who had transitioned from commercial aviation after losing his airline position due to industry downsizing. Hayes had been conducting traffic reports for 18 months and was known for flying at lower altitudes than recommended to capture dramatic footage. At 5:15 p.m., Hayes departed from a local airfield in a Robinson R-44 helicopter for routine rush hour coverage. The aircraft had been experiencing intermittent engine warning lights that Hayes had not reported to maintenance personnel, believing them to be false indicators. The live broadcast began at 5:45 p.m. during peak traffic coverage. Hayes was providing updates while hovering at 400 feet above the Interstate 405 and Interstate 10 interchange, significantly below the recommended minimum altitude for traffic reporting operations. The Robinson R-44 requires a minimum of 500 feet of altitude for successful auto-rotation under ideal conditions. Hayes's operating altitude of 400 feet provided insufficient margin for emergency procedures, particularly in the urban environment, with obstacles and limited landing options. At 5:52 p.m., while maneuvering in gusty wind conditions to capture footage of a traffic accident, Hayes experienced complete engine failure during the maneuver. Later assessment of the recovered components indicated the engine had suffered critical internal damage that caused the loss of power during the maneuver. At the low altitude Hayes was operating, the sudden loss of engine thrust left no practical opportunity to establish a controlled auto-rotation. Witnesses monitoring the broadcast reported a brief emergency transmission, noting an engine failure just before the helicopter began a rapid, uncontrolled descent. The transmission ended abruptly, and the live feed showed the helicopter descending too rapidly for any recovery attempt. The combination of low altitude, turbulence, and the urban environment left insufficient time and space for a successful auto-rotation. Multiple ground-based traffic cameras captured the helicopter's uncontrolled descent toward the busy Interstate 405 corridor. Footage showed Hayes making control inputs during the descent, but the low altitude and urban layout left no viable emergency landing options. The helicopter struck a concrete overpass support structure during the uncontrolled descent. The impact occurred at 5:54 p.m. and was captured live by the traffic cameras feeding into the station's rush hour coverage. The concrete support structure was designed to withstand vehicle impacts, but created an immovable obstacle for the descending aircraft. The impact ruptured the fuel system, and a fire began burning around the wreckage. Emergency crews arrived at 6:02 p.m. and found Hayes with injuries incompatible with survival. Later examination confirmed Hayes died from massive blunt force trauma during the high-speed impact with the concrete support structure. Several traffic camera feeds continued transmitting smoke and debris scattered across the roadway until responders blocked the surrounding lanes and redirected the cameras away from the wreckage. After the final camera feed was shifted off the crash site, the station moved on from the live segment. The sequence of events indicated that the sudden engine failure at low altitude left no usable options for emergency descent, making the impact unavoidable once the helicopter began losing lift. It was July 23, 2016, when 29-year-old meteorologist Paige Donovan made a decision that would cost her everything. Known throughout the weather station as fearless and ambitious, Paige had built her reputation over 6 years by going where other forecasters wouldn't dare. Her colleagues often joked that she chased storms like others chased dreams, but on this sweltering Arizona evening, that fearlessness would prove fatal. For 3 days, Paige had been tracking what she believed would be the summer's most significant thunderstorm system, approaching Phoenix. The massive cell promised to deliver the kind of dramatic footage that separated good meteorologists from great ones. While her competitors played it safe with indoor coverage, Paige saw opportunity in the approaching danger. The weather station's observation deck had been her target location all afternoon. Despite her producer's initial refusal, Paige's persuasive arguments about capturing competitor-beating footage eventually won approval. The covered deck, surrounded by metal railings and equipment housing, offered the perfect vantage point to showcase the storm's raw power. Perched on the 10th floor of the downtown broadcast tower, it gave Paige an unobstructed view of the city skyline and a dangerously exposed position once the storm drew closer. What nobody realized was that the building's grounding system, installed decades earlier, no longer met modern safety standards. As evening approached, Paige positioned herself on the deck with her camera operator. The storm system, initially 8 miles away, began moving faster than meteorological models had predicted. Lightning flickered in the distance like nature's own strobe lights, each flash bringing the danger closer to the downtown station. Then everything changed in an instant. A lightning bolt struck the building's antenna array with devastating force. The inadequate grounding system failed catastrophically. Instead of safely directing the electricity into the ground, the current found alternative pathways through the metal infrastructure surrounding Paige's position. Although the building's surge protection system had been installed years earlier, its corroded grounding cables couldn't safely channel the lightning's residual current, allowing electricity to arc unpredictably through the structure. The electrical surge traveled through the metal railings and equipment housing, creating a deadly electrical field across the observation deck. Paige, standing near the metal railing while gesturing toward the approaching storm, became an unwitting conductor in nature's most violent electrical display. The moment her hands contacted the electrified railing, a residual current estimated at around 7,000 volts coursed through her body, energy redirected through the metal structure rather than from the lightning's full charge. The electricity entered through her hands and exited through her feet, following the path of least resistance through her vital organs. Her heart couldn't withstand the surge and stopped beating immediately. The electrical shock caused instant cardiac arrest and respiratory paralysis, effects typical in lightning electrocution. Paige collapsed unconsciously within seconds, severe electrical burns marking the entry and exit points where the current had traveled. The same electrical surge that killed her also damaged the camera equipment, cutting the live broadcast feed and leaving viewers staring at static screens. The surge also overwhelmed the studio's surge protectors, frying the transmission relays that linked the broadcast tower to the studio feed. Emergency responders reached the weather station within minutes. They found Paige in full cardiac arrest, her body bearing the telltale signs of electrical trauma. Despite immediate CPR and advanced life support measures, her heart had sustained irreversible electrical damage. At the Regional Trauma Center, medical teams fought desperately to restart her heart, but the electrical injury had been too severe. The same lightning that Paige had spent her career studying had ultimately claimed her life through a tragic combination of aging infrastructure and split-second timing. It was August 29th, 2017, in Northern California, during one of the region's most active wildfire seasons. Afternoon temperatures were in the high 90s, and thick smoke drifted across the foothills as crews from several counties worked to contain a fast-moving fire that had already burned hundreds of acres. Local news outlets broadcast live updates from the perimeter, showing tall smoke columns visible from miles away. Among the firefighters assigned to the incident was 32-year-old Miguel Serrano, a seasonal wildland crew member with 5 years of experience. He worked summer fire seasons across multiple counties and often volunteered for difficult assignments. That morning, he was placed on a 3-person engine crew positioned along a narrow access road on the fire's eastern edge, where containment lines were being reinforced. The terrain was uneven with dry brush, loose soil, and scattered oak trees. Winds shifted unpredictably, pushing embers across the road. From a distance, television cameras captured smoke rolling down the hillside. Reporters remained at a roadblock where law enforcement kept them behind a marked safety boundary. Miguel's crew worked on clearing brush and reinforcing a handline meant to slow the fire's advance. Another unit operated a short distance upslope. Witnesses later said conditions looked stable. Winds were steady, flame height moderate, and the fire appeared to be moving laterally rather than downhill. The first sign of trouble came when a sudden wind shift pushed embers into a pocket of unburned brush below the crew's position. The ignition was nearly immediate. A flare-up ignited a small section of vegetation and grew rapidly, sending flames upward toward the handline. Nearby firefighters shouted warnings, and radio traffic captured urgency as conditions deteriorated faster than expected. Miguel attempted to pull a hose line back toward the road when the wind intensified again. The fire produced a brief torching effect, with a vertical column of flames rising as heat drew air upward. Embers blew across the hose, forcing him to adjust his footing. Witnesses from the adjacent crew reported seeing him stumble on loose soil near a drop-off along the slope. As he tried to regain balance, flames surged toward the line. The fire overran the narrow section of brush where Miguel stood. With vegetation igniting behind him, his escape route narrowed instantly. A local news camera positioned farther down the road captured the moment the flame front moved through the area. Only a few seconds aired before the photographer reflexively lowered the camera and the broadcast shifted. When the smoke thinned enough for nearby crews to see, Miguel was lying near the burned slope, unresponsive. Firefighters attempted to reach him, but heat pockets and falling debris forced them to approach cautiously. Additional crews used hand tools to cool the area before others moved in with protective gear. Responders on site conducted an assessment once the flames subsided. From the roadblock, reporters filmed firefighters clearing space while personnel directed media away. Later that evening, officials confirmed that Miguel Serrano died from extensive third-degree burns consistent with exposure to a rapidly advancing flame front. Investigators reviewed wind data, radio logs, and broadcast footage to determine that a sudden downslope gust pushed flames toward the handline too quickly to escape. Agency leaders later updated escape route spacing and wind monitoring points for slope operations. It was July 18, 2017. The medieval towers of Banska Štiavniča's historic castle complex cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as afternoon tourists wandered through centuries-old corridors. Roman Hruška had discovered his passion for Slovak medieval history 3 years earlier. What began as weekend castle visits evolved into the 46-year-old's appearances on local TV and occasional regional broadcasts where he conducted walking tours for viewers across Europe. The segment that afternoon was airing live on regional television, broadcast in real time from the castle grounds. His insurance background gave him an eye for structural details, but his enthusiasm often overrode caution. Roman's signature move involved physically touching ancient walls and leaning against historical features to create intimate connections with the past for his audience. Medieval castles present unique hazards for modern visitors. Stone structures built centuries ago lack contemporary safety standards, with narrow passages, uneven surfaces, and deteriorating wooden elements that may appear solid but are weakened over decades. That afternoon, Roman had convinced a security guard to allow him brief access to the castle's upper balcony, a section normally locked to public tours due to ongoing structural assessments. The wooden railing system dated to the 19th century and showed visible weathering, but Roman dismissed concerns as bureaucratic overcaution. He told his cameraman he wanted to show the panoramic view from the balcony's edge. Weather reports indicated recent heavy rains had saturated the region, potentially affecting wooden structures, but Roman and the crew were unaware of this. Roman positioned himself against the balcony's wooden railing, addressing his audience during a live broadcast while gesturing toward the courtyard below. He leaned backward against the barrier for dramatic effect, explaining the castle's defensive architecture to his engaged audience. The weathered railing fasteners began to pull free from their anchors under repeated pressure, creaking ominously. But Roman ignored the warning sounds, continuing his presentation while applying increasing force to the compromised railing system. And then, the wooden barrier gave way unevenly, the post pulling free from its anchors. Roman's full weight had been resting against the compromised railing when it failed, sending him tumbling backward into empty air, dropping nearly 40 feet. His body striking the stone courtyard with devastating force. Tourists in the courtyard screamed as Roman's chest hit the cobblestones first, followed by his head. The transmission ended abruptly moments later. A nearby tourist contacted emergency services, while onlookers remained with Roman until responders arrived. 12 minutes later, paramedics arrived and found that the injuries were fatal. The coroner's report determined Roman died from massive blunt force trauma. The castle immediately closed the upper sections for comprehensive structural review, discovering multiple areas with compromised wooden elements and conducting an investigation into the guard's temporary access decision. The investigation resulted in the guard being fired for granting access, in violation of safety protocols. It was August 17, 2017, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The morning was clear, and inside the downtown television studio, producers hurried to finalize the day's live broadcast. On the schedule was a wildlife education segment featuring a python, an animal considered safe under routine handling but unpredictable in the heat and noise of a studio. Daniel Park, 31, was a volunteer animal technician from a small regional wildlife center. He had spent years working with reptiles in controlled habitats, feeding, cleaning, and assisting with veterinary checks. Only recently had he begun stepping into public demonstrations, encouraged by the center's outreach staff. By temperament, he was mild and methodical, someone who trusted routine over improvisation. His motivation was straightforward: raising awareness to secure more donors for the struggling facility. He was not reckless, but he often bent to requests from hosts and producers to make the animals seem more engaging. Non-venomous pythons, though not dangerous under proper management, are powerful constrictors. Stress factors like heat, lights, and sudden noise increase the chance of defensive tightening. Standard practice requires 2 trained handlers and a controlled environment, but live television often skipped safeguards for timing and simplicity. That morning, Daniel arrived with a secure crate containing a 6-foot python. The animal was healthy but known to grow restless under overstimulation. The segment was squeezed into a tight window. Producers pushed Daniel to have the snake out quickly and even suggested draping it around an anchor. Hesitant but cooperative, he complied, hoping to preserve the center's relationship with the station. The studio was hotter than expected, with lamps and microphones raising the temperature. Several staffers later recalled how rushed it felt. Daniel knelt to guide the python out, speaking calmly but moving faster than usual. The snake coiled onto his arm at first, but its movements grew sharper. Instead of pausing to settle it, Daniel stepped toward the cameras, following the producer's cue. Control room staff noticed his posture stiffen as the snake wrapped higher across his chest. The first sign of trouble was subtle. His arm tensed as he tried to adjust his grip. Within seconds, the python locked in, wrapping firmly around his torso. On air, the host's expression shifted from a forced smile to alarm as Daniel leaned back, pulling at the coils. Witnesses saw his breath shorten. Assistants rushed in, trying to pry the snake loose, but it tightened further with the commotion. One staffer dialed 911. Cameras briefly captured the struggle before control cut to an emergency slate. Daniel remained upright but visibly strained, his face reddening. Moments later, his knees buckled as the snake compressed his chest. A medic on standby for another segment attempted to intervene, and staff used scissors to partially free him, but Daniel had already collapsed from cardiac arrhythmia caused by oxygen deprivation. Paramedics transported him to a nearby hospital, but he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The snake was returned unharmed to the wildlife center, placed back into a controlled habitat. The station suspended live animal features, cutting the segment from archives and halting future broadcasts pending review. At the Wildlife Center, the tragedy prompted an overhaul of outreach. Live demonstrations were limited to pre-recorded segments, with a veterinarian or senior technician mandated for handling. It was February 14, 2017, at Lake Minnetonka, Minnesota. Morning conditions showed partly cloudy skies with temperature at 28 degrees Fahrenheit and light northwest winds. The National Weather Service had recorded unusual temperature fluctuations during the previous week, with daytime highs reaching 45 degrees Fahrenheit, followed by overnight lows dropping to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. These temperature swings had created unstable ice formations throughout the lake system, particularly near shoreline areas where warm underground springs fed into the lake. David Kellerman, 28, was a weekend weather reporter for a local cable channel who had taken the position 8 months earlier to pay off student loans from his meteorology degree. Kellerman's professional experience was limited to standard weather broadcasts from the station parking lot, with no previous experience reporting from ice-covered bodies of water. He had been passed over for the main meteorologist position twice and was attempting to demonstrate his field reporting capabilities through increasingly ambitious outdoor broadcasts. Family members later confirmed that Kellerman was unable to swim, a fact he had never disclosed to his employer. This information was not included in his employment records, and no swimming ability assessment had been conducted during hiring. At 6:45 a.m., Kellerman arrived at the Lake Minnetonka public access with camera operator Anthony Dane and sound technician Lisa Park. Local ice fishermen warned the crew about dangerous ice conditions near the shore, where warm springs created unstable formations. The fishermen advised staying at least 100 yards from the shoreline and recommended testing ice thickness before positioning equipment. Kellerman dismissed the warnings, stating the camera needed positioning closer to shore for optimal shot composition. He expressed confidence in his ability to assess ice safety based on visual inspection and meteorological training, despite having no practical experience with ice conditions. The live broadcast began at 7:23 a.m. during the morning show's weather segment. Kellerman positioned himself 25 yards from shore, where ice thickness measured only 2 inches over moving water, well below the commonly recommended minimum thickness for supporting a person. At 7:31 a.m., while using an ice auger to demonstrate ice thickness measurement, Kellerman stepped onto ice that appeared solid but had been severely weakened by underwater spring activity. The ice immediately gave way, creating a breakthrough approximately 3 feet in diameter. Dane reported hearing a sharp cracking sound before Kellerman disappeared through the ice surface. Dane's camera captured Kellerman's confused expression before he fell through the compromised ice section. Kellerman surfaced once, gasping and attempting to grab the ice edge. However, his heavy winter coat and boots quickly absorbed water and pulled him beneath the surface. On camera, he surfaced once and released a sharp gasp before slipping under again. Rescue personnel later noted the pattern was consistent with cold water shock contributing to rapid water inhalation. Dane contacted emergency services at 7:33 a.m. while the broadcast continued. A water rescue team arrived at 7:48 a.m. with cold water gear and located Kellerman at 8:02 a.m., about 15 feet from the breakthrough point, trapped beneath the ice shelf. He was brought to shore, where paramedics began CPR and rewarming procedures using standard hypothermia protocols. Efforts continued for 12 minutes with no signs of recovery. Kellerman was pronounced dead at 8:15 a.m. after resuscitation attempts failed. The broadcast showed portions of the recovery until the crew was guided back to shore. Later review confirmed the thin, spring-weakened ice had failed under his weight. It was January 19, 2018, when 33-year-old field reporter Jared Fulton arrived at what would become his final assignment. With 9 years of experience covering severe weather events across the Midwest, Jared had built a reputation as one of the most thorough and safety-conscious reporters in the region. His colleagues respected his meticulous preparation and professional approach to dangerous weather coverage. But on this frigid Oklahoma evening, even his careful nature couldn't protect him from a tragic miscommunication. The assignment was covering a historic ice storm that had left widespread power outages and created hazardous conditions throughout the Oklahoma City metropolitan area. Ice accumulation had reached unprecedented levels, with some areas reporting over 3 inches of ice coating on trees, power lines, and roadways. The freezing rain had also disabled several cellular towers, forcing emergency crews to rely on spotty radio communication and handwritten reports. The storm had battered the region for 2 days, turning it into a landscape as beautiful as it was deadly. Jared had positioned himself in a residential neighborhood to document the ice accumulation and interview residents who were coping with extended power outages in sub-freezing temperatures. The location seemed ideal. It offered dramatic visuals of ice-laden trees and allowed him to showcase the storm's impact on ordinary families. What he didn't know was that utility records for the area were incomplete due to storm-related communication failures between repair crews. Utility crews had been working around the clock to restore power, battling ice accumulation and the continuous threat of falling tree branches weighted down with ice. Power lines that crews believed had been de-energized were sometimes still carrying dangerous electrical current due to incomplete documentation during the chaotic restoration efforts. As evening approached, Jared began setting up for his live broadcast near what appeared to be a safe location away from major power lines. The scene around him was both beautiful and ominous. Trees bent under the weight of ice, creating a crystalline landscape that sparkled under the streetlights. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Jared began his live evening broadcast, standing near the ice-covered trees to demonstrate the storm's dramatic impact on the residential area. His report was informative and compelling, showing viewers the real challenges that residents face during extended power outages in dangerous winter conditions. He described the beauty and danger of the ice accumulation while maintaining his professional demeanor. The catastrophic failure happened without warning. The oak tree branch, no longer able to support the massive weight of accumulated ice, cracked completely and began falling toward the ground. The branch struck a power line that utility crews had incorrectly believed was disconnected from the electrical grid. The line was still energized by a nearby substation after automatic grid rerouting minutes earlier. The impact caused the power line to snap and fall directly onto Jared, who was standing 8 feet away and had no time to react. The 13,200-volt electrical current caused immediate cardiac arrest as it entered his body through his shoulder and exited through his leg. Witnesses saw a brilliant blue-white arc flash as the wire contacted his shoulder, momentarily illuminating the ice-covered scene. The electrical shock killed him instantly. Emergency responders arrived within 12 minutes, but found that death had been instantaneous. The live broadcast captured the entire incident before the camera operator shut down the equipment. Jared was pronounced dead at the scene from electrical cardiac arrest. It was August 14, 2018 in Hutchinson, Kansas, a warm weekday morning during the taping of a small community cable variety show. Inside the barn-style studio, the air was dry and still as about 60 people, mostly local families and farmers, sat in folding chairs around a fenced demonstration pen used for livestock segments. Karen Wyatt, 41, was a veterinarian who had spent more than a decade working among the small cattle and goat farms scattered throughout the region. Colleagues described her as steady and methodical, someone who preferred calm handling techniques and rarely rushed through demonstrations. She often volunteered at local events and had appeared on the program once before, making her familiar with the studio layout and the routine for livestock segments. Producers planned a short demonstration on horn management for young cattle. A young bull was brought into the pen, smaller than a mature animal but still strong and unpredictable. 2 ranch hands stayed inside the enclosure to assist. Audience members were reminded to remain seated and avoid sudden movements. The setup was basic. Overhead lights hung from a low wooden frame, and the floor was packed dirt. The pen was built from metal panels anchored to a non-structural center post, mainly used for attaching signage. A roaming camera operator stood at the gate, while another camera on a tripod recorded a wide shot for the community channel. Karen began the segment by holding a rope lead attached to the bull's halter, explaining common safety steps. At first, the bull moved calmly, shifting its weight and kicking small puffs of dust into the air. A few audience members later said they noticed it stepping more frequently, but nothing suggested immediate risk. The incident occurred when Karen turned slightly toward the host to answer a question. Several witnesses reported seeing the bull sidestep twice and lower its head. Karen adjusted the rope, but the movement that followed was too fast to counter. The bull lunged forward without warning. The horn struck Karen in the chest with a sharp impact that several attendees said they heard over the studio microphones. The force lifted her backward, driving her into the center post. The post snapped at the base, kicking up a burst of dirt as it gave way. Karen collapsed near the edge of the pen. Audience reactions were mixed. Some people jumped up, others moved into the aisles, while a portion remained frozen in place. Ushers attempted to keep spectators from pressing toward the panels as the ranch hands acted quickly. One handler tightened the rope. The other pushed the bull against the far side of the pen. The control room cut the cable feed seconds after the impact. Dust settled around Karen as staff cleared the walkway and moved the bull out. EMTs arrived within minutes, entered through the side door, and began their assessment while ushers created space and kept spectators back. A short time later, officials confirmed that Karen Wyatt had died from internal injuries, including severe trauma to her chest and abdomen from the horn strike. Recovered broadcast footage, which captured the bull's sidestep and rapid lunge, was later used to confirm the sequence of events. The station released a brief statement and canceled all animal handling segments for the season. A review team was assigned to inspect the pen design, the failed support post, and the overall setup used for demonstrations. The barn studio remained closed for inspections through the week. It was May 14, 2014. The morning air at a small regional wildlife park in the Moravian Silesian region of the Czech Republic carried the familiar scent of hay and animal musk as staff prepared for what should have been a routine educational broadcast. Marek Dolezal, 41, had spent 12 years as a zookeeper before transitioning to television work 3 years earlier. His show, broadcast on local regional networks, focused on wildlife education with a personal touch that set him apart from polished nature documentaries. The zoo's insurance company had recently tightened restrictions on media access, specifically discouraging live broadcasts involving direct enclosure entry. But Marek's history as former staff allowed him special privileges that bypassed several newer safeguards. Large ungulates like the European bison require specialized handling protocols due to their unpredictable nature and massive size. Even experienced keepers maintain safe distances and never turn their backs on these powerful animals, whose territorial instincts can trigger sudden aggressive behavior without warning. Direct, unsupervised human presence inside an active bison enclosure is normally prohibited under modern zoo safety standards. That morning segment was designed to demonstrate proper visitor behavior around large hoofed animals. The production team had chosen the bison enclosure specifically because Marek had worked with this particular animal for years. The segment was airing live on a regional morning television program with no broadcast delay, as the production team followed Marek into the enclosure. However, recent budget cuts had reduced staffing, and the usual safety coordinator was absent. A second keeper assigned as a spotter had been pulled away to cover another enclosure, leaving Marek alone. Weather conditions were optimal, but the animal had been agitated earlier due to construction noise from nearby renovations that the zoo administration had failed to postpone. The plan called for Marek to enter the main enclosure alone, positioning himself near the primary gate while explaining safe observation techniques. The entry was a procedural violation that went unchallenged due to Marek's seniority and the pressure of a live broadcast schedule. However, maintenance workers had used the secondary service gate earlier that morning to deliver fresh bedding, and although the latch appeared engaged at a glance, debris prevented it from fully seating. Cameras rolled as Marek entered the enclosure. The 2,200-pound bison initially remained calm, grazing near the far wall while Marek explained proper body posture to viewers. Confident in his experience, he gradually moved closer to demonstrate how humans should position themselves to appear non-threatening. This approach contradicted the advice he was verbally giving, but it was subtle enough that no one intervened. As he spoke, Marek slowly backed toward what he believed was the secured secondary gate, unaware that it stood slightly ajar behind him. Without warning, the bison's demeanor shifted. The animal raised its massive head, snorted once, and charged directly at Marek with devastating speed. Live television viewers watched in horror as the 2,200-pound animal struck him squarely in the torso, ramming him backward with its head and chest, and driving his body through the partially open gate as it flexed inward. Marek hit the concrete service area hard, his legs twisted at unnatural angles. Momentum carried the bison partially into the threshold, where it pinned and trampled Marek with repeated crushing blows. The camera operator froze in shock as staff members screamed off camera. The live feed cut abruptly mid-scream as the broadcast director realized what was happening. On-site zoo emergency staff reached the scene within 90 seconds, using emergency protocols to drive the animal back into the enclosure and secure the gates. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, but Marek had already succumbed to his injuries. The coroner's report determined that Marek died from massive internal trauma, caused by multiple blunt force impacts. Marek's archived episodes were quietly removed from broadcast rotation, and his family received an undisclosed settlement from the zoo's insurance company. It was April 12, 2016, in Cleveland, Ohio. The noon broadcast at a small local station began like any other weekday. The studio lights bright, the air conditioned, and the newsroom running on its usual tense rhythm. No one imagined that a routine food segment would end in a tragedy that unfolded in seconds. Melissa Harding, 39, had worked at the station for 6 years as a midday anchor. She had built her career on projecting authority, but inside the newsroom she was known more for her sharp tone and constant demands than for teamwork. She frequently berated interns and producers over minor issues, often treating her position as a platform for control rather than collaboration. Colleagues recalled her habit of eating during breaks, sometimes even mid-broadcast, and how she scolded staff if snacks were missing from her desk. Her polished on-air presence contrasted with her impatience off-camera, a contradiction that sometimes pushed her into careless behavior. The environment of a live broadcast demands discipline. Anchors must transition seamlessly between stories, follow precise timing, and maintain clear diction under pressure. Any distraction, whether equipment failure, misplaced notes, or food consumption, can disrupt the rhythm of a program. Producers routinely reminded Harding of the risks of eating while cued, particularly during lighter segments. Like many anchors, she assumed her routines were safe. And in a setting where dozens of decisions happened every minute, one overlooked caution could shift events dramatically. That day's lineup featured a short segment promoting a local deli. Harding was irritated about the rushed preparation and snapped at an assistant who brought out a sample plate she deemed poorly presented. Off camera, she ate several bites while waiting for her cue, ignoring reminders to hold off until the live demonstration. Control room staff noted her impatience, but the broadcast proceeded as scheduled. As cameras rolled, she transitioned from a local story into casual banter, having just swallowed a bite when her airway suddenly caught. On live television, the accident began without warning. Mid-sentence, her voice broke into a strained wheeze. Her eyes widened, and she froze, one hand moving to her throat. Viewers saw her knock over a coffee mug as she staggered sideways, panic evident. Her co-anchor reached across the desk, slapping her on the back, but the obstruction remained. Within less than a minute, her legs buckled and she collapsed, toppling her chair with a crash. The control room erupted in chaos. Floor crew rushed onto set, shouting for emergency services as the station abruptly cut to commercial after nearly 20 seconds of live struggle. On the studio floor, producers attempted the Heimlich maneuver multiple times. Witnesses recalled her nails scraping the table as she convulsed, her complexion turning dusky blue. Staff tilted her forward, trying to clear her airway, but the blockage held. Paramedics arrived within minutes using suction and advanced airway equipment. Despite intervention, the obstruction remained sealed. She was transported to a nearby hospital but pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Medical examiners later confirmed a dense piece of deli meat had completely lodged in her trachea, cutting off airflow. Her funeral drew family, but only a handful of co-workers. Many declined to attend, citing grievances over her treatment of colleagues. The service was subdued, reflecting a career marked more by friction than friendship. The station issued a brief statement of condolence and immediately pulled the archived segment from circulation. It was July 4, 2017, in Sacramento, California, at a small outdoor event space. Morning conditions showed clear skies with a temperature of 82 degrees Fahrenheit and light southwest winds. The National Weather Service had issued a heat advisory for the Sacramento Valley, with forecast temperatures reaching 104 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-afternoon. Thomas Mitchell, 51, was a former restaurant owner who had lost his business to bankruptcy 6 months earlier. Mitchell was appearing on a morning show to demonstrate Independence Day grilling techniques as part of holiday programming. His restaurant experience included extensive commercial cooking, but limited experience with outdoor propane equipment. Holiday preparations were underway across the park, with early picnic groups settling near the river as temperatures climbed. Metal surfaces around the cooking areas had already warmed, and a few visitors later recalled a faint fuel odor near the grill, assuming it came from normal outdoor cooking. At 8:30 a.m., Mitchell arrived at the event area with morning show host Jennifer Adams and camera operator Steve Wilson. Mitchell was using a propane tank that had been dropped during transport, creating internal damage to the pressure regulator that was not visible through external inspection. The pressure regulator had sustained internal damage that affected its ability to maintain proper pressure levels and prevent dangerous gas accumulation. Mitchell had attempted repairs using hardware store components rather than professional propane equipment parts designed for the specific application. The live broadcast began at 9 a.m. during holiday programming. Mitchell positioned himself at a large outdoor grill to demonstrate seasoning techniques and cooking methods for holiday barbecues. At 9:17 a.m., while lighting the grill for his demonstration, the damaged pressure regulator allowed unburned propane to accumulate inside the grill housing. When Mitchell activated the ignition system, the gas ignited in a sudden flash fire that extended outward from the grill. The ignition caused a rapid burst of flame that enveloped Mitchell and ignited his clothing, producing a brief fire plume around the grill area. Wilson's camera captured the moment the flash fire erupted, and the sudden flame front pushed Mitchell backward from the grill as his clothing ignited. Flames spread rapidly across his shirt and arms, and park visitors hesitated to approach until the fire subsided enough for extinguishers to be used. When the flames finally subsided, Mitchell remained motionless beside the grill, his clothing reduced to charred fabric, and his skin showing extensive burn damage. Adams kept her distance while several visitors cautiously splashed bottled water onto the concrete near the grill, unsure whether any heat remained trapped inside the housing. Wilson continued filming from several steps back as thin smoke drifted through the cooking area and the surrounding picnic groups moved away. Responders arrived minutes later and immediately assessed Mitchell's condition, but found no signs of movement or any recoverable condition. With the area still radiating heat and scorch patterns spreading across the concrete, crews focused on securing the equipment and isolating the propane tank fragments before covering Mitchell's body. The broadcast shifted away once the grill was cordoned off and the crew was moved behind the safety line. A later inspection confirmed that propane had accumulated inside the grill housing due to the damaged pressure regulator, and ignition of that trapped gas caused the flash fire that engulfed Mitchell almost instantly. It was October 14, 2017, when 28-year-old sports reporter Damon Ellis arrived at what would become his final assignment. With 5 years of experience covering college athletics, Damon had built a reputation as an energetic journalist who brought genuine enthusiasm to every game he covered. His colleagues knew him as someone who always went the extra mile to capture the perfect shot. But on this homecoming Saturday in Texas, that dedication would prove fatal. The assignment was covering the homecoming game between two fierce rival universities. The atmosphere was electric, with alumni returning to campus and students preparing for what promised to be one of the most exciting games of the season. Damon had specifically requested this assignment because of his expertise in college sports and his ability to capture the raw emotion that made these rivalries compelling. Arriving 3 hours before kickoff, Damon was determined to create comprehensive coverage that would showcase the entire homecoming experience. He had convinced his producer to let him broadcast from a temporary platform erected in the stadium's upper deck, arguing that the elevated position would provide spectacular crowd shots and give viewers a unique perspective. The stadium was a 40-year-old concrete structure that had hosted countless games over the decades. While maintenance crews had noted some structural concerns with the upper deck during routine inspections, the facility had been cleared for normal use. The temporary broadcast platform had been installed by a subcontractor using mounting points that appeared secure, but had not been properly load tested for the additional weight of broadcast equipment. The subcontractor had reused decades-old anchor bolts embedded in weathered concrete, unaware that years of corrosion had weakened their grip. The crowd's synchronized chants amplified the structural vibrations, matching the platform's natural frequency, a phenomenon engineers call resonance, which rapidly accelerated the loosening. As game time approached, the stadium began filling with an enthusiastic crowd that would eventually reach near capacity, with tens of thousands of spectators packing the stands. The energy was palpable as fans streamed into their seats wearing team colors. Damon positioned himself on the platform with his camera operator, excited about the dramatic footage they would capture. Damon began his live pre-game show, interviewing alumni and describing the incredible atmosphere building around him. His enthusiasm was infectious as he painted a picture of college football at its finest, with passionate fans creating an environment that epitomized amateur athletics. The mounting bolts had been installed to standard specifications, but the sustained crowd vibrations were producing stresses the setup was never meant to withstand. The rhythmic movement was gradually loosening the connections, creating a dangerous situation that nobody could detect. Damon noticed the platform beginning to sway slightly, but assumed it was normal movement from crowd activity. He had worked from temporary structures before and trusted that proper safety protocols had been followed. His focus remained on delivering compelling coverage, unaware that the platform's structural integrity was rapidly deteriorating. The failure happened without warning. The mounting bolts suddenly gave way completely, causing the entire platform to separate from its attachment points. Damon and 800 pounds of broadcast equipment began falling 85 feet toward the concrete concourse below. The fall lasted only 2.3 seconds. He struck the concrete surface with tremendous force, suffering immediate fatal head trauma and instant death. It was December 6, 2015 in Jaipur, India, during a cool and dry afternoon, as spectators lined the main parade route for the annual holiday procession. Families, students, and neighborhood groups filled the barricaded sidewalks, while the local community cable channel broadcast the event live, using 2 mobile camera units placed along the roadway. Harish Menon, 45, worked as a school maintenance technician and was well known in his neighborhood for helping local cultural groups build parade displays. Friends described him as patient and skilled with bamboo frames, cloth backdrops, and basic electrical fixtures. He had assisted in several community events over the years and was invited to join the procession because organizers trusted his steady handling during live segments. The route included a gentle upward slope near an intersection. Parade organizers knew the float would pass beneath older, uninsulated distribution lines, but they had not accounted for how the incline would reduce the clearance as the vehicle climbed. The metal frame was already tall, and the added height from the slope brought it closer to the overhead wires than expected. As the float reached the incline, spectators near the barricades noticed one of the rear banners starting to sag. Harish stepped toward it, leaning slightly over the platform rail to pull the cloth back into place. Witnesses later said he kept his focus on the banner and did not look up to check the height of the frame as the float continued up the slope. From the roadside and on the cable broadcast, viewers saw the top of the metal structure rising toward the overhead distribution line. As the tractor moved a few more feet forward, the highest point of the frame brushed the uninsulated wire. The metal frame was bolted directly to the tractor's chassis, which provided a continuous conductive path to ground. The contact created a brief jerk in the structure, enough for several spectators to notice the frame flex slightly. What followed happened quickly. A sharp crack came from the wire, and a bright flash spread across the upper section of the frame. People closest to the float said they heard a buzzing sound as the lights on the float went out at once. Harish had one hand on the metal rail while reaching for the banner, and the moment the flash occurred, witnesses reported seeing his arm tense and his body lock in place for an instant. His legs straightened, and his shoulders pulled back in a rigid posture. The force of the current caused him to lose footing, and he fell backward onto the platform, landing near the edge without making any further movement. Sparks dropped from the point of contact above, briefly illuminating the rear section of the float. Parade marshals moved along the barricades to keep spectators from pushing closer, while the 2 volunteers on the platform stepped away from the railing and toward the opposite side. The broadcast continued for a few seconds, until the control room cut to a standby graphic. Later, investigators reviewed the recovered footage to confirm the exact moment the frame touched the wire. EMTs arrived within minutes, entering the area only after utility workers confirmed the line was no longer energized. Responders climbed onto the rear platform and checked Harish for breathing and circulation, while spectators watched from behind the barricades. The assessment was brief. Officials later confirmed that he died from electrocution caused by high-voltage current traveling through the metal frame when it contacted the overhead wire. Staff documented the damaged frame, the point of contact, and the float's lighting system before it was moved. Authorities halted the parade at that section and ordered new height surveys for future routes. It was September 9th, 2015. The morning air in Łódź, Poland carried the familiar hum of industrial machinery as workers began their shifts at the city's largest textile manufacturing complex. What should have been a routine tour would become one of the most horrific industrial accidents ever broadcasted live. The tour was airing live on a business-focused television program, broadcast in real time from the factory floor. Piotr Lewandowski was a 38-year-old marketing consultant turned TV personality entrepreneur. Despite having no manufacturing experience beyond a few marketing contracts with industrial clients, he confidently featured factory tours as content that would demystify modern production for small business owners. Colleagues who knew him from his consulting days later described him as routinely dismissive of operational safety concerns. He'd convinced the factory management to allow filming during active production hours, arguing that authentic footage required real working conditions, a decision later cited as a policy exception and enforcement failure. Textile manufacturing involves massive looms operating at high speeds, with fabric moving through complex roller systems. Safety zones are clearly marked with yellow paint and warning signs, creating buffer areas around equipment that can catch loose clothing or body parts in milliseconds. Piotr had arranged to film during peak production hours, specifically for dramatic effect, dismissing the plant manager's suggestion to tour during maintenance periods. The factory supervisor had explicitly noted that lockout and tagout would not be performed, and access was visual only. But Piotr waved off the concerns, claiming his audience needed real industrial atmosphere. He wore a loose button-down shirt, despite being advised to change into fitted clothing, insisting his professional appearance was essential for credibility. Piotr positioned himself next to a massive industrial loom to explain fabric production speeds to viewers. Yellow warning lines clearly marked the danger zone around the machinery, but Piotr stepped beyond them to keep the equipment in frame behind him. His camera operator, a freelancer hired for the day, also crossed the line in violation of site rules, following his movements without questioning the positioning. The loom's massive rollers spun at full speed just 3 feet away, processing cotton fabric in continuous sheets. As Piotr gestured toward the machinery while speaking to his camera, his loose shirt sleeve brushed against the loom's intake roller. The fabric caught instantly, and in less than 1 second, the machinery pulled his entire arm into the mechanism. Piotr was yanked forward violently, his shoulder dislocated as parts of his torso twisted against the machine's frame. The camera fell to the concrete floor, but continued transmitting live, capturing audio of emergency alarms and machinery noise echoing across the factory floor. The live feed was cut moments later from the control room, as supervisors realized the severity of what viewers were witnessing. Workers reacted immediately, cutting power via the emergency controls, though the machinery's momentum kept it moving briefly. The supervisor dialed for help, and the paramedics arrived 15 minutes later. By then, Piotr had already sustained non-survivable injuries and was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's report determined death resulted from traumatic crush injuries and massive blood loss. The textile factory entered bankruptcy protection and later restructured following lawsuits, regulatory scrutiny, and sustained negative publicity after the incident. It was June 17, 2015, in Seattle, Washington. A bright summer morning framed a television studio's outdoor set, where crews rushed to prepare for a segment of a home improvement program. The scene felt routine, but beneath it lay a structural flaw, an error that would not forgive even a moment of wait. Jerry Mills, 45, was a contractor with 2 decades of remodeling experience. He ran a small business serving mostly residential clients and had built a reputation as a no-nonsense worker who finished jobs quickly. Off camera, colleagues described him as brash and sometimes careless, but audiences liked his energy and plain explanations. He had become a regular guest on the program, a way to generate business and remain visible in a crowded market. Promoted as a trusted expert, he thrived on the attention. Construction for television differed from real jobs. Instead of months, he had minutes to show a process. Producers wanted speed, visuals, and minimal dead time. Jerry worked with standard carpentry tools and fasteners, but instead of a house frame, he often demonstrated on temporary stages dressed to look authentic. Time pressures meant corners were cut, but he believed he could handle the risks. For him, exposure outweighed hesitation. That day's segment involved a simulated backyard deck installation. Producers had ordered a raised platform to serve as the demonstration surface. The structure was built quickly by stagehands, not carpenters, and its stability relied on several adjustable jacks beneath the frame. One jack looked stable at first but was not fully seated, creating a weakness that showed only when weight shifted onto the outer corner. No inspection was scheduled, and the problem went unnoticed. The audience sat less than 10 feet away, and there was no second rehearsal. Jerry arrived with his tool belt, ready to demonstrate how a ledger board connected to a wall frame. He stepped to the platform's outer corner, which carried the hidden fault. The host introduced him as cameras rolled, the crowd of about 40 applauding. The atmosphere looked polished and safe, yet the corner under him flexed more than expected. As he hammered the first nails, a sharp crack cut through the air. Witnesses saw the platform shift and sag toward the audience. The sound escalated into a snap, and the corner dropped suddenly. Jerry lost balance, falling forward as the structure collapsed beneath him. The drop was only 3 feet, but he struck his chest against a concrete prop before his head hit another edge. Live cameras caught everything. The anchor's expression freezing, audience members shouting, crew running into frame. Stage assistants rushed to pull a tarp across the scene while others called emergency responders. Jerry still moved, but his breathing was shallow, blood marking the side of his head. Paramedics arrived within minutes and transferred him to Harborview Medical Center. Despite treatment, he was pronounced dead later that evening. The aftermath centered on a wrongful death suit filed by Jerry's family against the network and its contractors. It alleged that the platform had been assembled without inspection and that safety was sacrificed for production speed. The settlement was undisclosed, but the program soon disappeared from schedules, a quiet acknowledgement of liability without public admission. It was March 22, 2018, at a public high school in Phoenix, Arizona. Morning conditions showed clear skies with temperature at 78 degrees Fahrenheit and light southeast winds. The school's aquatic facility had recently completed extensive resurfacing work, creating more slippery conditions than the previous surface material. Rebecca Martinez, 44, was the school's swimming coach, conducting a live educational broadcast for the local public access channel during National Water Safety Week. Martinez had been taking prescription medication for chronic back pain that included warnings about potential effects on balance and coordination. At 1:30 p.m., Martinez arrived at the pool facility with camera operator Mark Thompson. The pool area contained several maintenance hazards that had not been properly secured following recent construction work, including a temporary electrical distribution panel positioned near the pool area containing 240-volt electrical connections. The electrical panel had been left energized to power pool systems during the transition period between construction completion and final electrical inspection. It had been placed in an unsafe location near the pool and had not yet undergone final safety checks. Several staff members later recalled noticing moisture collecting along the deck seams throughout the morning, likely from condensation and residual humidity trapped in the enclosed pool area. A few commented that the new surface seemed unusually slick even before filming began, but assumed it was normal for freshly applied coatings. The live broadcast began at 2:15 p.m. during the educational segment. Martinez positioned herself near the pool edge to demonstrate proper poolside safety techniques and supervision methods. At 2:28 p.m., while walking backward along the pool deck to demonstrate proper positioning for lifeguard supervision, Martinez stepped on a wet section of the newly resurfaced deck. The surface coating became extremely slippery when wet, causing her feet to slip out from under her. Martinez fell backward and struck the temporary electrical distribution panel with tremendous force. The impact caused her to make contact with exposed 240-volt electrical connections, resulting in immediate electrocution as electrical current passed through her body to the grounded pool deck. Thompson's camera captured the moment of electrical contact, as Martinez's body convulsed from the electrical shock. The sound of electrical arcing was audible through the broadcast audio system, and visible sparks were captured by the camera. Thompson instinctively stepped back as the sparks intensified, and the broadcast briefly showed an unfocused view of the deck as the camera shifted in his hands. A sharp crack from the panel echoed through the enclosed facility, and several nearby students flinched at the sound as the lighting in the area flickered. The electrical contact caused visible burn damage, and Martinez collapsed immediately as her body went limp from the shock. The 240-volt current was sufficient to cause fatal electrical injuries within seconds, leading to immediate loss of consciousness. Thompson called for help at 2:30 p.m., and arriving responders first focused on securing the electrical hazard rather than initiating immediate treatment. Power to the area was cut before anyone could approach Martinez safely. Once the scene was declared clear, medical personnel checked for signs of life but found no pulse, no breathing, and no response to neurological assessment. The pattern of burns and the absence of cardiac activity indicated she had likely died within seconds of contacting the energized components. The broadcast gradually shifted away as crews cordoned off the deck and began documenting the equipment layout. Facility staff restricted access to the entire pool area, and later review confirmed that the combination of the wet resurfaced deck and the energized temporary panel created the fatal conditions. It was September 8, 2015, when 31-year-old traffic reporter Mara Jennings climbed into what would be her final helicopter ride. With 8 years of aerial broadcasting experience, Mara had become the calm voice that Los Angeles commuters relied on during their daily battles with gridlock. Known for her unflappable demeanor during chaotic traffic situations, she had earned respect throughout the industry for her professionalism and dedication to keeping drivers safe. That Tuesday morning promised to be particularly challenging for LA's notorious traffic patterns. A freeway construction project along one of the city's main interstate routes was causing unprecedented delays, backing up traffic for miles. Mara had specifically requested the early morning shift to provide comprehensive coverage of what transportation officials were calling the worst construction-related congestion in the city's history. The news helicopter lifted off from its downtown helipad as dawn broke over the sprawling metropolis. Mara settled into her familiar position, headset adjusted and notes organized, ready to guide millions of commuters through another day of urban navigation. What she didn't know was that her aircraft had been experiencing intermittent radio communication issues for 3 days, forcing her pilot to rely more heavily on visual navigation. As the helicopter climbed to its standard reporting altitude of 1,000 feet above the congested freeway corridor, air traffic control was noting an unusually busy morning in the skies. 5 news helicopters and 2 police aircraft were operating in the same general airspace, all drawn to cover the massive traffic disruption. The convergence of so many aircraft was creating a complex aerial dance that required precise coordination. The danger began building when a competing station's helicopter approached from the east, also seeking the best vantage point to cover the same massive traffic incident. Both aircraft were operating at similar altitudes, drawn to the most dramatic visual representation of the morning's transportation crisis. The pilots were experienced professionals, but the combination of heavy air traffic and compromised radio communications was creating a potentially deadly situation. As Mara continued her live broadcast, describing alternate routes and estimated delay times, her pilot initiated a banking turn to maintain safe separation from the approaching aircraft. Standard aviation protocols required clear radio coordination, yet Mara's helicopter's faulty transceiver caused heavy static, blocking an advisory warning about nearby aircraft convergence. The collision happened with terrifying suddenness. The tail rotor of the competing helicopter struck the main rotor assembly of Mara's aircraft, sending shards of rotor blades and fragments scattering through the air. Both helicopters immediately lost their ability to maintain controlled flight, entering rapid descents that would end in tragedy. Mara's helicopter, having lost its main rotor completely, fell approximately 1,100 feet in seconds. The aircraft struck the concrete freeway median at high speed, causing immediate structural collapse that killed both occupants instantly from massive impact trauma. The crash resulted in an immediate fuel fire that engulfed both aircraft wreckage. The same traffic jam that Mara had been reporting on became the backdrop for her final moments, as emergency responders struggled to reach the crash site through the very congestion she had dedicated her career to helping others navigate. It was November 3rd, 2018, in coastal Grayford, Oregon, during an active thunderstorm warning that had been upgraded an hour earlier. Wind pushed inland from the shoreline, and scattered rain swept across the waterfront district. Most residents stayed indoors while the regional news station prepared extended severe weather coverage. Assigned to the field update was 29-year-old Arvin Smith, a junior correspondent known for volunteering for outdoor segments in unstable conditions. He had been with the station just over a year, and often insisted on covering storms directly from the coast instead of from safer inland spots. The control booth initially instructed the team to stay closer to their vehicle for the live shot, but Arvin pushed for a position along the shoreline barrier. After several exchanges, the crew followed him toward the coastal edge despite reservations. A camera operator, Jonas Reed, and a sound technician, Mira Patel, accompanied him. Both later confirmed they preferred a location farther back, where pooling runoff wasn't spreading across the pavement. Arvin stepped forward to frame the water behind him, and indicated the shot looked clear enough. They set up near a concrete barrier separating the coastal road from the water. Lightning had been offshore earlier, but the storm shifted inland faster than radar models predicted. The control booth told the team to keep the segment short, reminding them that lightning safety applied even during brief hits. At 6:12 p.m., the broadcast switched to Arvin's live shot. Viewers saw him standing a few feet from the barrier while waves struck the rocks behind him. Wind pulled at his jacket, and the microphone carried intermittent static. Arvin began explaining the approaching storm band, urging viewers to avoid flooded, low-lying routes. Behind him, the sky flickered. Mira monitored the audio feed and glanced toward the waterline repeatedly. Jonas adjusted his stance, aware of the shifting gusts. In the control booth, staff watched the radar tightening over the shoreline and prepared to cut away. The incident occurred roughly 30 seconds into the report. A violent thunderclap hit nearby, loud enough that the camera feed shook. Viewers later reported seeing a bright flash behind Arvin. According to Jonas, lightning struck a tall metal mooring post near the jetty. The electrical discharge traveled down the pole and spread across the rain-soaked pavement as a surface ground current. Arvin, closest to the point of spread, appeared to take the direct impact. The flash filled the frame. The live feed captured Arvin's body stiffening, then collapsing forward onto the pavement. Jonas lowered the camera abruptly while Mira stepped back and warned him not to touch metal equipment. The station's short delay buffer wasn't long enough to prevent the first seconds of the collapse from airing. The anchors froze mid-sentence before the cutoff was activated. Rain intensified as the crew reacted. Jonas moved toward Arvin but hesitated when another flash lit the clouds. Mira signaled to a nearby security patrol for help. Arvin remained motionless, his microphone and cables scattered across the wet pavement. When lightning activity eased, the crew edged closer. Arvin did not respond. Jonas stayed several feet back, wary of residual ground charge, while Mira waved down a security vehicle approaching from the marina. The emergency call was placed within moments. EMTs arrived about 6 minutes later, entering only after security confirmed conditions were stable. Responders performed an on-scene assessment while the crew waited near the road's edge. The station canceled all remaining field reports and switched to in-studio radar coverage. Later that evening, officials confirmed that Arvin Smith died from cardiac arrest and internal injuries caused by the lightning strike. Footage helped investigators review the timing of the flash and identify conductive structures at the scene. The station issued new rules requiring greater distance from metal fixtures, stricter storm proximity thresholds, and crew veto power for unsafe positions. It was November 22nd, 2013. The morning air at Valparaiso's main shipyard carried the familiar scent of salt and diesel fuel, while workers made final preparations for the ceremonial launch of a 180-foot cargo vessel, unaware that the day's routine would become someone's last assignment. Diego Rojas, a 35-year-old correspondent, had built his reputation live covering Chile's maritime industry for 8 years. The launch coverage that morning was airing live on regional television, broadcast in real time from the shipyard. His colleagues at the television station respected his technical knowledge and fearless approach to getting dramatic footage. Diego specialized in maritime launches, understanding the complex engineering behind moving massive vessels from dry dock to water using gravity, grease, and precisely calculated momentum. Ship launches require vessels weighing hundreds of tons to slide down angled rails into water, with timing and positioning critical to prevent catastrophic accidents during the uncontrolled descent. Diego's confidence around ships had earned him exclusive access to restricted areas that other journalists couldn't reach. His editor had specifically requested close-up footage of the hull entering water for their evening maritime segment. Previous launches had made Diego somewhat complacent about safety protocols, often positioning himself closer to the action than harbor officials recommended. He'd covered dozens of similar ceremonies without incident, likely developing an almost casual attitude toward the inherent dangers. That morning, shipyard engineers had miscalculated the friction coefficients on the launching rails due to recent rainfall that had washed away protective grease. The 400-ton vessel was expected to descend at a controlled pace, but reduced friction caused it to accelerate far faster than engineers anticipated. Harbor officials issued standard safety warnings to media personnel, establishing a 50-foot exclusion zone around the launch area. Diego entered the exclusion zone against explicit warning. His cameraman later stated that Diego dismissed the precautions as overly conservative, having witnessed similar launches from closer distances. Once the blocks were released, no emergency mechanism could stop the vessel's momentum. Diego positioned himself directly between the concrete quay and the ship's hull, seeking dramatic angles that would capture the vessel's massive scale as it entered the water. His cameraman warned him about the tight space, but Diego insisted the footage would be worth the risk. At 11:45 in the morning, the ceremonial bottle broke against the bow, and workers released the restraining blocks. The ship began its descent faster than anyone anticipated. Within seconds, the accelerating hull pinned Diego against the concrete quay, compressing his torso under immense weight. His chest suffered massive compression, his ribcage crushed inward and internal organs severely damaged, while the hull continued its momentum for several seconds before settling into the water. Diego was incapacitated instantly. Survival under the 400-ton load was impossible. Workers at the shipyard called for help without delay, though paramedics arrived 12 minutes afterward to discover Diego had already died. The brief live broadcast later became crucial evidence in the subsequent safety investigation. The coroner determined multiple internal organs were severely damaged by the crushing force, consistent with unsurvivable injuries. The Maritime Authority conducted an investigation into how media personnel and Diego were allowed into the hazard area. Diego's funeral drew hundreds of dock workers and journalists who remembered his dedication to maritime reporting. It was September 9, 2018, in San Diego, California. The morning sky was clear but carried unpredictable winds at higher altitude. Crowds gathered along the waterfront for a televised promotional air event. Few realized that timing adjustments and hurried decisions would soon turn a spectacle into disaster. Mark Levin, 39, was a freelance aerial camera operator with more than a decade of broadcast experience. He had built his reputation on reliability, moving between regional affiliates and local sponsors. Known for saying yes to last-minute calls, Mark often accepted assignments with little preparation. Though not reckless, he tended to prioritize getting the shot over double-checking safety margins. The airshow contract had come through at the 11th hour, and he agreed without hesitation, motivated by steady pay and the chance to expand his portfolio. Shooting an airshow required specialized placement. Mark was stationed on a scaffolding lift just outside the crowd line, positioned for a clear angle on formations. He carried a stabilized long lens and headset for live direction. The setup gave him unobstructed sight lines, but minimal protection compared to an enclosed tower. Under normal conditions, the risk of debris was remote but not absent. especially with tight formation flying. His headset linked him to the director's booth, ensuring he tracked formations across the skyline. That day's complication came from shifting winds. Pilots were briefed on shear at certain altitudes, complicating precision timing. Instead of delaying, teams agreed to minor adjustments. One pair, under pressure to stay on schedule for broadcast, committed to flying closer than usual. Safety officers flagged the move as unnecessary, but the show proceeded. Mark, focused on the broadcast line, remained in position despite the narrower margin. As the routine began, ground cameras followed smoke trails curving upward. Mark's feed showed cross maneuvers threading against blue sky, and producers cued his angle for the broadcast. Witnesses later said the formations looked rushed, spacing tighter than typical. Tension built as the teams moved into a weaving pattern, their aircraft converging in split-second timing. At the peak of the maneuver, two planes clipped wings. Viewers watching live saw the sudden spray of fragments and one aircraft spiraling down. The crowd gasped as metal and flame streaked across the sky. From the scaffolding, Mark had the direct line of sight. His camera tracked the uncontrolled tumble until wreckage began breaking apart. A broken strut and fuselage panel separated in mid-air, dropping toward the spectator zone. Falling from several hundred feet, the section slammed into Mark's platform with enough force to buckle its frame. Witnesses described a metallic thunderclap as the impact shook the scaffolding violently, throwing him over the guardrail. Crew nearby shouted for help as he fell, striking the ground hard. On the live feed, the screen cut between the anchor's shocked expression and emergency vehicles rushing onto the field. Medics arrived within moments, but Mark had sustained fatal trauma. He was pronounced dead at the scene, alongside two pilots who perished in the crash. His equipment lay twisted and broken, the lens shattered on the pavement. The station suspended live aerial coverage indefinitely, not just as a procedural step, but as acknowledgement of the risks their crews faced. Staff who witnessed the crash organized internal safety reviews, rewriting procedures for camera placement and platform stability. It was December 31, 2016, at a riverside event area in Louisville, Kentucky. Evening conditions showed partly cloudy skies with a temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit and light southeast winds. Recent rainfall had saturated ground conditions where temporary stage foundations had been installed for the New Year's Eve celebration. Michael Torres, 29, was a stage manager hired 3 days earlier when the original manager resigned over safety concerns. Torres had limited experience with large-scale temporary installations. Lighting technician Sarah Kim, 24, was working her first major outdoor event and was unfamiliar with temporary staging systems. Crowds had already begun gathering throughout the park despite the cold weather, and staff were moving equipment cases and cables across the damp ground while preparing for the midnight program. Several workers later recalled seeing small areas of standing water near the stage supports, but assumed it was typical after recent rainfall. The temporary stage measured about 40 feet wide and 30 feet deep, supported by a platform raised roughly 20 feet above the ground. The structure had been constructed using materials that met minimum code requirements, but had been designed under significant time and budget constraints. Recent rainfall had compromised ground conditions and reduced foundation stability. Later review of construction notes indicated the stage supports were not designed for the full weight of the lighting equipment, sound systems, and personnel present during the broadcast. The total equipment weight exceeded design capacity under the compromised soil conditions. The live broadcast began at 11:58 p.m. during the countdown to midnight. Torres was directing final lighting adjustments, while Kim operated overhead equipment positioning systems on the stage platform. At 11:59 p.m., while both workers were adjusting overhead lighting arrays, several support connections failed after the saturated soil beneath the platform shifted, causing the structure to lose stability. Event coordinator Mike Stevens reported hearing loud cracking sounds before a section of the stage platform collapsed. The partial collapse caused Torres to fall approximately 20 feet, along with several pieces of heavy lighting equipment. A 200-pound lighting fixture fell with the collapsing section and struck Torres in the head and neck area, causing immediate fatal trauma. Kim was thrown from the collapsing section but landed on the remaining stable portion of the stage, sustaining severe injuries, including multiple fractures and internal trauma. She remained conscious but was critically injured. Multiple cameras captured the collapse as it occurred during the live countdown broadcast. Emergency services were contacted immediately, while the live broadcast continued showing the wreckage and initial response efforts. Emergency crews arrived at 12:07 a.m. with equipment suited for stabilizing the damaged structure. Torres was found deceased at the scene, having died instantly from massive head trauma caused by the falling lighting equipment. Kim was extracted from the stage at 12:25 a.m. and transported to a nearby hospital with life-threatening injuries. Despite emergency surgery, Kim was pronounced dead at 12:47 a.m. from the severity of her traumatic injuries. Later examination confirmed Torres died from massive head trauma caused by impact with falling lighting equipment. Later findings noted Kim's fatal injuries were consistent with severe trauma sustained during the structural failure. The live broadcast captured the entire sequence from the initial collapse through the rescue operations. Later review of the damaged structure showed several weaknesses that likely contributed to the failure. The findings suggested the collapse was the result of overloaded equipment on unstable, rain-softened ground, leaving both workers with no chance of escape once the platform gave way. It was December 12, 2017, when 26-year-old field reporter Caroline Mercer made the choice that would define her final broadcast. With 4 years of experience covering natural disasters throughout Southern California, Caroline had built a reputation as a dedicated journalist who never backed down from dangerous assignments. Her colleagues admired her unwavering commitment to telling important stories. But on this windy December afternoon in Southern California's foothills, that fearless dedication would prove fatal. The assignment was covering mandatory evacuations in a mountain community threatened by a rapidly spreading wildfire that had already consumed 12,000 acres of drought-stricken terrain. The fire was being driven by powerful Santa Ana winds that were pushing the flames toward residential areas with unprecedented speed and intensity. Had positioned herself at a residential evacuation checkpoint to interview fleeing residents and document the emergency response efforts. The checkpoint was strategically located on a mountain road that served as the primary escape route for hundreds of families whose homes lay directly in the fire's projected path. Her news van was equipped with emergency communication equipment, but the mountainous terrain had been causing intermittent radio contact. Fire officials had been warning all media personnel that shifting wind patterns could change the fire's direction rapidly and without warning. The Santa Ana winds were notorious for their unpredictability, capable of turning a controlled situation into a life-threatening emergency within minutes. Despite these warnings, Caroline insisted on remaining in the area to provide comprehensive coverage. As the afternoon progressed, Caroline conducted interviews with evacuating families, capturing their fear and determination as they fled their homes. Her reporting was compelling and human, showing viewers the real impact of natural disasters. The evacuation checkpoint buzzed with activity as emergency vehicles guided residents to safety. The wind patterns that had been stable throughout the morning began shifting dramatically. What had been a predictable fire suddenly became an unpredictable monster, driven by 45-mile-per-hour Santa Ana winds. The fire's advancement speed increased from 1 mile per hour to a terrifying 3 miles per hour, with flames reaching heights of 40 feet and temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Fire officials immediately announced that all personnel needed to evacuate the checkpoint area, as the wind shift had put the location directly in the fire's new path. Caroline received the evacuation order, but chose to continue broadcasting as she moved toward her news van, hoping to capture footage of the approaching fire front. The superheated air ahead of the flames created an environment that was lethal even before the fire itself arrived. Temperatures soared above survivable levels, while toxic smoke filled the air, making breathing impossible. Caroline suffered severe smoke inhalation as the oxygen was consumed by the approaching inferno, followed by third-degree burns over 85% of her body as the fire engulfed her position, The intense fire conditions prevented emergency responders from reaching her location for 47 minutes. When firefighters finally found her, Caroline had succumbed to smoke inhalation and thermal injuries. It was March 4, 2016, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, during a routine morning newscast on a regional TV station. Outside, the weather was mild and traffic moved normally. Inside the compact studio, the early crew prepared for the 6 a.m. broadcast. Camera checks, microphone tests, and teleprompter adjustments followed the usual sequence. Lana Reyes, 28, was a morning reporter who occasionally filled in at the anchor desk. Co-workers described her as quiet and self-directed, someone who preferred preparing her segments alone and kept most of her belongings close during shifts. She often arrived early for morning broadcasts, bringing a small personal bag she kept near her workstation during on-air blocks. Outside of her assigned community updates, she rarely interacted on set unless prompted, and several colleagues noted she tended to manage her breaks and workspace independently. The studio setup included 2 cameras aimed at the desk, one operated manually and the other on a fixed track, while a digital backdrop displayed the station logo. Behind the glass wall, the director, audio technician, and teleprompter operator monitored the rundown from the control booth. At 6:07 a.m., the broadcast transitioned to Lana for her scheduled public affairs segment. She read steadily from the teleprompter, and nothing in her delivery suggested a problem during the first half of the report. Midway through the segment, Lana paused while the teleprompter continued to scroll. The operator later said the pause looked deliberate. Lana then made an unscripted remark about the morning rundown, causing several people in the control booth to turn toward the director. Moments later, she lowered her eyes toward the open space under her workstation. Her hand moved out of frame as she reached downward. From the booth and the studio floor, staff could see her lift a metallic object as she raised her hand back into view. The station had a short delay buffer, intended only for correcting minor on-air slips. It was too brief to prevent the initial seconds of what followed from airing. Before the director could switch to another camera or cut the feed, Lana brought the firearm upward and turned it toward herself. A single discharge occurred while she remained in frame. On the studio floor, the main anchor froze before pushing his chair back. One camera operator stepped away from the desk, while another kept his camera pointed forward until the director ordered a stop. In the control booth, the audio technician muted the studio microphones as the director instructed the switch to a standby graphic. Crew members near the set moved toward the hallway, while a producer called for emergency services and alerted building security. Security arrived within minutes and directed non-essential staff out of the room. About 5 minutes after the call, EMTs entered the studio and were guided to Lana's position. Cables were cleared from their path. Responders performed an on-scene assessment while staff waited in the hallway. The station switched to pre-recorded content for the remainder of the broadcast. Later that morning, officials confirmed that Lana Reyes had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound during the live segment. The station issued a brief statement acknowledging the on-air incident and noting that a full internal review and formal investigation were underway. Live programming for the week was suspended, and the newsroom remained closed for safety and procedural evaluations. It was February 2nd, 2016. The Atlantic winds swept across the volcanic cliffs of a remote Canary Island overlook, with deceptive calm, carrying salt spray and the promise of an approaching storm system that would claim a life before evening. Elena Mariana Mendez, 29, had spent 3 years covering routine weather segments from the safety of studio green screens, desperately seeking opportunities to demonstrate her capabilities as a field correspondent. Her colleagues described her as determined, but inexperienced in dangerous field conditions, often volunteering for assignments others avoided to build her reputation. Coastal cliff reporting presents unique challenges, where sudden crosswind and downslope gusts can create unpredictable forces exceeding 60 miles per hour. Professional field reporters typically use safety harnesses and work with experienced crews who understand environmental hazards, but Elena's network operated on limited budgets with minimal safety protocols. That morning, Elena received an assignment to cover an approaching Atlantic storm system from one of the Canary Islands' exposed clifftop overlooks. The network scheduled the segment as a live field report, broadcast in real time from the clifftop as the storm approached. The segment was designed to showcase the raw power of approaching weather, with producers specifically requesting dramatic visuals of Elena reporting against strong winds. Meteorological services had issued wind advisories warning of gusts up to 70 miles per hour, but network executives pressured Elena to proceed, emphasizing the competitive advantage of live cliffside coverage despite escalating conditions. Elena arrived at the location wearing standard business attire and worn, smooth, leather-soled dress shoes, carrying only a handheld microphone and earpiece. The clifftop overlook had no safety barriers, just a narrow ledge of volcanic rock overlooking a 120-foot drop to jagged coastline below. Her cameraman expressed concerns about the deteriorating conditions, hesitating alongside her as gusts grew stronger, but both ultimately deferred after producers reiterated their instructions over the earpiece. As the live broadcast began, wind speeds were already approaching dangerous levels. Elena positioned herself within 6 feet of the cliff edge, struggling to maintain composure as gusts whipped her jacket and forced her to widen her stance for stability. Producers, monitoring from the studio, encouraged her to move closer to the edge for more dramatic footage, prompting visible hesitation from both Elena and the cameraman as conditions worsened. A sudden, violent crosswind gust struck the clifftop with devastating force. Elena staggered sideways, her microphone scraping against volcanic rock as she fought for balance. The live camera captured her losing footing on the uneven stone as she slipped toward the edge, followed by a sudden spike in audio distortion before the feed cut away. Acting quickly, the cameraman left his filming gear and called for help from the cliff, though the remote terrain kept rescue personnel from arriving for 45 minutes. Specialized cliff rescue units rappelled down the rock face, locating Elena's body on the jagged coastline below. She had suffered massive blunt force trauma from the approximately 120-foot fall, including skull fractures, spinal breaks, and internal organ rupture, with injuries described as non-survivable upon impact. The incident prompted immediate investigations into field reporting safety standards. Elena's family filed wrongful death lawsuits against the television network, citing inadequate safety protocols and reckless endangerment, ultimately reaching confidential settlements. It was May 15, 2016 at Riverside Park in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Morning conditions showed clear skies with a temperature of 72 degrees Fahrenheit and light southwest winds. Recent spring storms had brought heavy rainfall and sustained high winds to the region, causing significant damage to trees throughout the Tulsa Park system. Amanda Sterling, 38, was a nature correspondent who had transitioned from park ranger work to television broadcasting 2 years earlier. Sterling's climbing experience consisted of basic recreational activities without professional training in technical rope systems or arborist techniques required for commercial climbing operations. At 7:30 a.m., Sterling arrived at Riverside Park with camera operator Pete Wilson. Sterling selected a large oak tree based on its photogenic appearance and proximity to parking areas. However, the tree showed subtle signs of recent storm damage that were not immediately apparent without close inspection by qualified arborists. Park maintenance records later revealed the oak tree had been marked for professional assessment and potential removal due to internal rot discovered during routine safety inspections. The warning tags had been obscured by spring foliage growth and were not visible during Sterling's site selection. Sterling was using borrowed climbing equipment from a recreational climbing group rather than professional arborist gear. The equipment had not been professionally inspected and showed signs of wear, including frayed rope fibers and worn hardware. The segment had no dedicated safety coordinator, and no one on the small production team had training in evaluating climbing or tree-related risks. The live broadcast began at 8:30 a.m. during the weekend morning show. Sterling positioned herself on a branch approximately 35 feet above ground to demonstrate climbing techniques and safety procedures. The branch appeared substantial from ground observation, but had been significantly weakened by internal decay and storm stress. Sterling's climbing rope was attached to the compromised branch rather than the main trunk, violating fundamental tree climbing safety principles. At 8:47 a.m., while repositioning for a better camera angle, Sterling's weight caused the compromised branch to exceed its structural limits. Wilson reported hearing a sharp cracking sound before the branch broke completely at its attachment point. Wilson's camera captured Sterling's fall as she struck multiple smaller branches during descent before impacting the ground head first. The smaller branches provided no meaningful deceleration, but caused additional trauma during the fall. Sterling's head struck exposed tree roots and rocks at the base of the oak tree with tremendous force. Wilson's camera continued recording as Sterling remained motionless, with no signs of voluntary movement or response. Wilson contacted emergency services at 8:49 a.m. while continuing live coverage. Paramedics arrived at 9:03 a.m. and found Sterling unresponsive, with no pulse and no spontaneous breathing. They noted significant external head injuries and no reaction to basic neurological checks. Paramedics attempted resuscitation procedures for 15 minutes, using advanced life support techniques. Despite aggressive intervention, Sterling showed no response to treatment. At 9:18 a.m., emergency medical personnel pronounced Sterling dead at the scene. Later examination confirmed the fatal injuries resulted from the 35-foot fall, with the impact against exposed roots at the base of the oak tree, causing catastrophic damage to her skull and upper spinal structures. The live feed continued during the response as crews worked around the tree, and viewers saw the camera shift back toward the ground position once Wilson was guided away from the area. After several minutes of limited footage showing only the base of the tree and rescue personnel moving equipment, the station quietly ended the segment and transitioned back to studio programming. It was March 15, 2017, when 34-year-old field reporter Tristan Cole arrived at what would become his final assignment. With 11 years of experience covering local news and construction stories, Tristan had built a reputation as a thorough journalist who wasn't afraid to get close to the action. His colleagues respected his dedication to capturing the human side of every story, but on this windy morning, that commitment would prove fatal. The assignment seemed routine enough, covering the topping-out ceremony of a new residential building downtown. The 12-story apartment complex represented a significant addition to the neighborhood, and Tristan had specifically requested the story because of his experience in construction reporting. Before setting up, Tristan signed in at the site office, collected a visitor's badge, and was given a brief safety orientation, a routine step on any active construction site. He was required to wear a hard hat and reflective vest, though his camera operator noted Tristan tended to inch closer than most reporters would for a better shot. The construction site buzzed with activity as crews prepared for the ceremonial placement of the final beam. Tristan positioned himself strategically to get the best angles, despite safety personnel warning him about staying within designated areas. The veteran reporter had covered dozens of local construction projects and felt confident in his ability to judge safe distances from heavy machinery. What concerned the construction supervisors that morning were the unusual wind conditions. Gusts were reaching 35 miles per hour, pushing the limits of safe crane operation. However, with media present and schedules to maintain, the decision was made to proceed with the ceremony as planned. The tower crane, a 15-year-old workhorse that had passed its recent inspection, stood ready to hoist the final 2-ton steel beam, the ceremonial topping-out piece, into position. Under normal circumstances, crane operations are suspended when sustained winds exceed 30 miles per hour or gusts reach 40 miles per hour. The site's safety officer had mentioned it was near that threshold, but the presence of local officials and media created subtle pressure to move forward anyway. Unknown to anyone on site, maintenance logs had documented hydraulic fluid leaks in the boom assembly over the past month. Temporary repairs had been made, but full hydraulic replacements were deferred until project completion. The subcontracted maintenance team had documented the issue, but flagged it as non-critical, meaning repairs could wait as long as hydraulic pressure remained stable. With tight deadlines and penalty clauses looming, management chose to monitor the leak rather than halt operations. The combination of aging equipment, compromised hydraulics, and extreme weather conditions was creating a perfect storm of mechanical failure. Tristan began his live broadcast, interviewing the project foreman about construction milestones. The camera crew set up roughly 60 feet from the crane's base, outside the marked exclusion zone. But during live coverage, Tristan instinctively stepped forward to frame the crane better behind him, crossing into the restricted area by only a few meters. His enthusiasm was evident as he described the local development rising behind him, unaware that he was standing within the crane's potential fall radius. The ceremony commenced with the crane operator beginning the delicate process of lifting the steel beam. As the load rose toward the building's summit, a sudden wind gust of 42 miles per hour struck the extended boom. The additional lateral force, combined with the heavy load, created stresses that the compromised hydraulic system simply couldn't handle. The sudden gust introduced a side load the crane's jib wasn't designed to resist. The slewing ring, which allows the boom to rotate, seized under the strain. A moment later, the entire upper section sheared off its turntable connection, sending the boom and cab hurtling downward. Tristan heard the loud metallic grinding and looked up to see the steel structure plummeting directly toward his position. Despite his quick reflexes and attempt to run, the laws of physics were unforgiving. The boom struck him within 1.5 seconds, crushing him instantly against the concrete ground. The grinding sound lasted less than a heartbeat, just enough for Tristan to glance upward. Witnesses later recalled him starting to move before the steel blurred into his frame. At that height, the falling section hit the ground in under 2 seconds. The impact was so severe that death was instantaneous. The crushing trauma to his head, chest, and spine left no possibility of survival. Construction workers who witnessed the accident stood in shocked silence, unable to comprehend how quickly the routine ceremony had turned into tragedy. The live feed froze mid-sentence, leaving viewers staring at an empty frame before the broadcast abruptly cut to black. It was November 8, 2016, in Nairobi, Kenya. The local news station's Westlands headquarters was packed with guests, contributors, and staff rushing between cameras during election night coverage. The broadcast gave the appearance of controlled energy, but behind the glass doors, poor security planning and an unchecked flow of visitors left the building exposed. Daniel Mwangi, 22, worked as a freelance camera assistant and part-time studio driver. He had been with the station only a few months, running feeds, helping with deliveries, and occasionally assisting with setup. Colleagues described him as reliable and eager, someone who accepted extra tasks without complaint in hopes of landing steadier work. His income was modest, but the job gave him connections in production, and he wanted to prove himself. Friends knew he took risks less out of recklessness than out of a desire to be noticed in a competitive field. Broadcast environments like this rely on layered security, controlled access points, credential checks, and monitoring in lobbies where live guests and volunteers gather. When those measures break down, the open floor plan becomes a liability. Election night added further strain. The station had multiple live feeds running simultaneously, extra chairs and cameras cluttering the atrium, and fewer guards than scheduled because of a staffing error. The lobby became a bottleneck with hurried movement, live mics nearby, and no reliable control over who entered. That night's broadcast was already running tight. Visitors passed through quickly, with reception distracted by constant arrivals. Crew recalled noticing a visibly agitated man outside earlier, arguing with a political contributor. Rather than increase caution, the pace of coverage pushed staff to focus on keeping the program moving. No additional security was brought in. The man later entered the lobby unchecked, shouting as he surged past the desk. Eyewitnesses remembered the sharp crack as glass splintered when the man fired a shot into the ceiling. Panic spread as volunteers ducked behind chairs and producers scrambled toward the stage. The shooter's second discharge hit near the ground, scattering debris. In the middle of the atrium, Daniel, carrying a coil of coax cable, moved with 2 other crew members toward the man in a split-second decision to intervene. Daniel lunged in, briefly grabbing the man's arm in an attempt to disrupt him while another crew member tried to force him backward. A violent struggle followed. The shooter twisted free. A muzzle flash briefly illuminated the atrium, and witnesses saw Daniel collapsing. The round struck his torso at close range. Chaos followed, crew pulling back, fire alarms blaring, and guests pressed against walls as staff pulled the injured away from the attacker's reach. Producers stopped the live segment mid-broadcast, cutting abruptly to off-site coverage while alarms echoed in the background. Paramedics arrived within minutes after being called by the staff. They performed chest compressions in the lobby before transporting him. He was admitted in critical condition, but died shortly after from severe internal hemorrhage from a gunshot to the torso. The shooter was restrained by officers outside the building less than 5 minutes later. Daniel's courage left an immediate imprint on his colleagues. Fellow production workers shared stories of his split-second decision to shield others, and a memorial wall was set up at the station with notes, photographs, and equipment he had used. His family took solace in seeing the community recognize his bravery, turning mourning into a narrative of courage and lasting impact. It was November 18th, 2017, in Springfield, Missouri, during a late afternoon school pageant aired on the local community access cable channel. The multi-purpose hall was warm, and several hundred students and parents filled rows of plastic chairs around a raised stage. The event was part of the school's annual cultural festival. Mira Talwar, 16, was a first-year student known for being quiet but dependable during school activities. Teachers described her as someone who followed instructions closely and participated without drawing attention to herself. She joined the pageant after her advisor encouraged her to try something new, and most of her preparation involved practicing the walking sequence and adjusting to the weight of her traditional costume. To fit the cultural theme, organizers placed lit candles inside short glass holders along the catwalk. Staff tested the spacing earlier and reminded contestants to stay centered, believing the layout was safe as long as everyone stayed within the marked line. The program began smoothly, and Mira completed her first walk without issues. During the second round, contestants stood slightly closer to the runway's edge for camera framing. As Mira shifted her weight to begin her turn, witnesses said she stepped just past the taped marker. The movement caused her gown's hem to swing outward and briefly into the area near one of the candles. A moment later, the lower edge of the skirt passed near one of the candles. Witnesses described seeing the fabric soften and curl as it touched the flame, followed by a sudden flare when heat concentrated on a single section of the skirt. Once ignited, the burning and melting material spread quickly across the lower layers, and heat began climbing along the folded sections of the dress. Several adults near the stage tried to reach her, but the hoop-style frame under the gown caused the melting fabric to cling to its structure and stay close to her legs. Mira tried stepping backward toward the center of the runway, but the uneven weight of the burning material pulled at the lower part of the skirt. Those nearest said she lost balance after only a few steps, dropping to one knee before falling fully onto her side. By then, witnesses saw flames rising toward the upper part of the dress, and the rigid frame underneath held the melting fabric close to her torso. Stage volunteers approached from both sides and attempted to lift portions of the skirt, but the fused layers did not separate. Fire blankets were placed over areas still producing open flame, while handheld extinguishers were used along the lower section. The live cable feed captured the first moments of ignition, and a brief view of Mira stepping backward before the control room cut the broadcast and switched to a standby graphic after a short delay. Emergency responders arrived minutes later and were guided directly to the stage. Staff cleared space around her as remaining hotspots were suppressed. Mira was transported from the hall but was later confirmed to have died from extensive burn injuries. Officials noted that the synthetic construction of the dress and the wire-supported frame intensified heat retention and reduced any chance of removing the burning layers. Footage from the live broadcast was used to confirm the sequence of events and support the final incident report. It was March 4th, 2018. The afternoon heat in Kano's central marketplace pressed down on the crowded auction pavilion, where over 800 people had gathered for a live televised charity fundraiser. Sadiq Musa, a 42-year-old television host, had built his career hosting local fundraising programs for a regional television network, becoming beloved for his animated presentation style and genuine connection with audiences. His background as a former market trader gave him credibility with working-class viewers who trusted his authenticity. For 6 years, he'd specialized in live auction broadcasts that raised money for local schools and medical facilities. Live television auctions in crowded venues present unique challenges, requiring hosts to manage both broadcast timing and crowd dynamics while maintaining energy levels that keep viewers engaged and bidding active. The format demanded constant audience interaction, with hosts frequently moving through crowds to interview bidders and showcase auction items. The network was competing with newer digital platforms for advertising revenue, putting pressure on hosts to create more dynamic content. Sadiq often left the stage to work directly with audience members, a technique that boosted viewer engagement, but required him to navigate dense crowds without assigned security escorts, a practice noted by colleagues as unsafe. His fearless approach to crowd work had become his signature style. That afternoon, the auction pavilion was packed beyond its 600-person maximum capacity, with additional attendees standing in aisles and doorways. Local fire officials had issued warnings about overcrowding, but event organizers ignored maximum occupancy restrictions to maximize fundraising potential. The venue's emergency exits were partially blocked by vendor stalls, reducing evacuation routes. Sadiq noticed the cramped conditions but continued broadcasting, likely trusting that his experience managing crowds would prevent problems. At 3:20 in the afternoon, during a heated bidding sequence for donated livestock, a false report of a structural failure spread through the crowd. The false alarm triggered immediate panic as hundreds of people simultaneously rushed toward the limited exits. Sadiq attempted to restore calm while remaining live on television, but he was quickly pushed into the surging crowd and knocked down within seconds, rather than having the time to intervene safely. His cameramen continued filming from behind and alongside the host, capturing chaotic footage as the crowd surged, partially obscuring Sadiq from view. The crowd surge pinned Sadiq to the concrete floor almost immediately. Witnesses later reported that he was knocked down and trapped under the surge within seconds, as the crowd surged forward, compressing him against the concrete floor and surrounding bodies. Emergency services were summoned at once by personnel, but ambulances were delayed 18 minutes in reaching the scene because of panicked crowds and obstructed access. Paramedics transported Sadiq to the local hospital, where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, despite aggressive resuscitation attempts. The coroner determined Sadiq died from compressive asphyxia and multiple blunt force injuries. Sadiq was one of 7 people killed in the stampede, with over 60 others hospitalized for crush injuries. Subsequent investigations highlighted that overcrowding, blocked exits, and lack of on-site security directly contributed to the fatalities, leading to new regulations requiring mandatory crowd control measures and security escorts for television hosts working in dense public gatherings.